The clock on the wall of Ruby's diner showed 9:30 p.m., and Lucy was already thinking about her aching feet. She had been on her feet for 12 straight hours, running between tables, refilling coffee cups, and forcing smiles even when customers complained about everything from the temperature of their soup to the color of the napkins. But Lucy couldn't complain. She needed this job more than anyone knew. Her younger brother Tommy was supposed to start college in 3 months, and they were still short on tuition money. Their parents had passed away in a car accident 2 years ago, leaving Lucy to raise her 17-year-old brother on her own. Tommy was smart, really smart. He had gotten into state university with a partial scholarship, but they still needed another $8,000 to make it happen. Lucy had been working double shifts at Ruby's diner for the past 4 months, saving every penny she could. The diner wasn't much to look at. It had been around since the 1950s, with cracked vinyl seats, wobbly tables, and a coffee machine that made strange noises when it worked at all. Old Ruby had passed away last year, and her nephew Pete now ran the place. Pete was a good guy, but he wasn't much of a businessman. The diner barely made enough money to keep the lights on, and Lucy knew that tips here weren't like the tips at those fancy restaurants downtown. On this particular Tuesday night, the dinner rush had been slower than usual. Only 3 tables had customers, and they were all regulars who Lucy knew by name. There was Mrs. Johnson, who came in every Tuesday for apple pie and decaf coffee. There was young couple Jake and Annie, who were saving money for their wedding and always split a burger and fries. And there was old Mr. Peterson, who had been coming to Ruby since the 1960s and always ordered the same thing: chicken soup and crackers. Lucy was wiping down the counter when she heard the bell above the door jingle. She looked up to see an elderly man stepping inside, moving slowly and carefully. He was probably in his 80s, with silver hair and deep wrinkles around his eyes that spoke of many years of life. What caught Lucy's attention immediately was his jacket. It was an old military jacket, olive green and worn at the edges, with patches sewn on carefully. Even though it was summer and quite warm outside, the old man wore it like it was part of him. He stood near the door for a moment, looking around the diner with careful eyes. Lucy could tell he was taking in everything: the menu board on the wall, the prices written in chalk, the empty tables. When their eyes met, she smiled and called out, "Good evening. Sit anywhere you'd like." The old man nodded and walked slowly to a corner booth, the kind where he could sit with his back to the wall and see the whole room. Lucy had noticed that some of the older customers preferred these seats, especially the ones who had served in the military. Her grandfather had been the same way before he passed away. Lucy grabbed a menu and a glass of water and walked over to his table. Up close, she could see more details about the man. His hands showed the wear of hard work, with small scars and calluses that told stories of a life spent doing physical labor. His eyes were kind but tired, the kind of tired that comes not just from a long day but from carrying heavy memories. "Here you go, sir," Lucy said, setting down the water and menu. "Take your time looking over everything." The old man picked up the menu and studied it carefully, not the way someone looks at a menu when they're trying to decide between a burger or a sandwich, but the way someone looks at prices when every dollar matters. Lucy recognized that look because she had been there herself many times. She watched as his eyes moved down the list, lingering on the cheaper items. After a few minutes, he set the menu down and looked up at Lucy. "Miss," he said, his voice soft but clear, "could I just get a cup of coffee, please, and maybe another glass of water?" Lucy's heart sank a little. She had seen this before. People who came into the diner wanting a real meal but only having enough money for coffee. It happened more often than people might think, especially with the older folks living on fixed incomes. "Of course," she said. "How do you like your coffee?" "Black is fine," he replied. "Thank you." As Lucy walked back to get his coffee, she found herself thinking about the man. There was something about him that reminded her of her grandfather, who had served in World War II but never talked much about it. Her grandfather had the same quiet dignity, the same way of sitting up straight even when he was tired. She poured the coffee and brought it back to his table, along with a small pitcher of cream and some sugar packets just in case he changed his mind. "Here you go," she said. Is there anything else I can get for you?" The old man wrapped his hands around the coffee cup like he was trying to warm them, even though it wasn't cold in the diner. "No, thank you, miss. This is perfect." Lucy went back to her other customers, but she kept glancing over at the man in the corner booth. He sipped his coffee slowly, making it last. She noticed that he kept looking at the menu even though he had already ordered. After about 20 minutes, she saw him reach into his jacket pocket and pull out a small wallet. He opened it carefully and began counting bills, all ones and fives, the kind of money someone collects from small purchases and spare change. That's when Lucy made her decision. She walked into the kitchen where Pete was cleaning the grill. "Pete," she said, "I want to send a plate over to the gentleman in booth 7. Put it on my tab." Pete looked through the kitchen window at the old man. "You sure, Lucy? You know I can't afford to give away too much food." "I'll pay for it myself," Lucy said. "Just make him a plate of the meatloaf special, the whole thing, meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, and a dinner roll." Pete nodded. He had worked with Lucy long enough to know that she had a good heart, maybe too good for her own financial situation, but he also knew better than to argue with her when she had made up her mind about something. 10 minutes later, Lucy carried a full plate of food over to the old man's table. His eyes widened when he saw her coming. "I'm sorry, miss," he said, "but I only ordered coffee." Lucy set the plate down in front of him with a warm smile. "This one's on the house," she said. "We have a policy here. Veterans eat free on Tuesdays." It wasn't true, of course. Ruby's Diner had never had such a policy, but something about the man's military jacket and the way he carried himself told Lucy that he had served his country, and she felt like that deserved recognition. The old man looked down at the plate, then back up at Lucy. She could see tears forming in his eyes. "Miss, I can't accept this. I have money to pay." "I'm sure you do," Lucy said gently. "But tonight it's my treat. Besides, the cook made too much meatloaf, and we'd just have to throw it away if someone doesn't eat it." Another small lie, but one that might help the man accept the meal without feeling like he was taking charity. The old man was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're very kind." Lucy patted his shoulder gently. "Enjoy your dinner," she said, and walked away to give him privacy. For the next hour, she watched from a distance as the old man ate slowly and deliberately, savoring every bite. When he finished, he sat for a while longer, just drinking his coffee and looking out the window at the quiet street. When he finally got up to leave, he walked over to the counter where Lucy was counting the day's receipts. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a small pin, an American flag about the size of a quarter. "This isn't much," he said, placing the pin on the counter. "But I want you to have it. What you did tonight, it means more than you know." Lucy picked up the pin and looked at it. It was simple but well made, the kind of thing someone keeps because it has special meaning. "Thank you," she said. "What's your name, if you don't mind me asking?" "Frank," the old man said. "Frank Sullivan, and you are?" "Lucy. Lucy Chen." Frank smiled. "Well, Lucy Chen, you've restored an old man's faith in kindness tonight. I won't forget this." After he left, Lucy pinned the small flag to her apron and finished closing up the diner. She had no idea that her simple act of kindness would change everything, not just for her, but for the entire town. Lucy woke up the next morning feeling good about what she had done the night before. The small American flag pin was sitting on her nightstand, catching the early sunlight that streamed through her bedroom window. She picked it up and looked at it again, remembering the grateful look in Frank's eyes when he had given it to her. Sometimes the smallest gestures meant the most, and Lucy felt like she had done something right in a world that often felt wrong. Her brother Tommy was already up, sitting at their small kitchen table with his laptop open and textbooks scattered around him. He was studying for his final exams, the ones that would determine whether he graduated with honors from high school. Lucy poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. "How's the studying going?" she asked. Tommy looked up and smiled. Pretty good. I think I'm ready for the math exam tomorrow. He paused and looked at his sister more carefully. You look tired, Lucy. You've been working too much. I'm fine, Lucy said, though she knew Tommy was right. The double shifts were wearing her down, but they only had 3 months left to save the money for his college tuition. She could rest after Tommy started school. I've been thinking, Tommy said, closing his laptop. Maybe I should take a gap year and get a job. Help you save money. Absolutely not, Lucy said firmly. You're going to college in the fall, just like we planned. I've got this handled. Tommy wanted to argue, but he knew that look on his sister's face. When Lucy made up her mind about something, especially something involving his future, there was no changing it. Lucy finished her coffee and got ready for work. She pinned Frank's flag to her uniform shirt, right next to her name tag. It felt like carrying a piece of yesterday's kindness with her. The morning shift at Ruby's Diner started at 7 o'clock, and Lucy was always there by 6:30 to help Pete set up. When she walked through the back door that morning, she found Pete standing by the phone with a strange expression on his face. Morning, Pete, Lucy said, hanging up her purse. Everything okay? Pete looked at her like he wasn't sure how to answer that question. Lucy, I need to ask you something. Did anything unusual happen last night after I left? Lucy thought about Frank and the free meal she had given him. Not really. Just the normal dinner crowd. Why? Someone called here about 20 minutes ago, Pete said, running his hand through his hair. Said they were from the Department of Defense. Lucy felt her stomach drop. The Department of Defense? Like the military? That's what they said. They were asking questions about you. About what happened here last night with some elderly gentlemen. Lucy's mind started racing. Had she done something wrong? Was it illegal to give away food? She knew Pete struggled to keep the diner profitable, but surely one free meal wouldn't get anyone in trouble with the government. What kind of questions? Lucy asked, trying to keep her voice calm. Pete sat down on one of the stools behind the counter. They wanted to know your full name, how long you've worked here, what kind of person you are. They asked about the old man, too. What time he came, in what he ordered, how long he stayed. Did you tell them? I told them you're a good employee and a good person, Pete said. But Lucy, they asked some strange questions, too. They wanted to know about the restaurant, how big it is, how many people it can hold. They asked about the parking lot, whether it could fit large vehicles. Lucy felt more confused than worried now. Large vehicles? What does that have to do with anything? I don't know, Pete said. But they said someone might be coming by today to talk to you. This morning passed slowly. Lucy tried to focus on her regular customers, but she couldn't stop thinking about the phone call. Every time the bell above the door rang, she looked up expecting to see someone in a military uniform. But it was just the usual crowd. Construction, workers grabbing coffee before heading to job sites, office workers picking up breakfast sandwiches, retired folks who came in for the early bird special. Around 10 o'clock, Mrs. Rodriguez came in for her weekly coffee date with her friend Mrs. Kim. They always sat in the same booth and talked about their grandchildren and their garden clubs. Lucy had been serving them for 2 years, and they always asked about her, life like she was their own granddaughter. Lucy, dear, Mrs. Rodriguez said as Lucy poured their coffee. You look worried about something. Everything okay? Lucy didn't want to concern them, but she also knew they would keep asking until she told them something. Pete got a strange phone call this morning, someone asking questions about the diner. Mrs. Kim leaned forward with interest. What kind of questions? Official questions, from the government apparently. The 2 older women exchanged glances. Mrs. Rodriguez had been married to a police officer for 40 years before he retired, and Mrs. Kim's son worked for the county clerk's office. They knew how government business usually worked. Government people don't usually call small businesses unless something important happened, Mrs. Kim said thoughtfully. Did anything unusual happen recently? Lucy thought about Frank again. There was an elderly veteran who came in last night. I gave him a free meal. Maybe that's what this is about. Mrs. Rodriguez smiled. Honey, giving a veteran a free meal isn't the kind of thing that gets the government involved. Unless what? Lucy asked. Unless that veteran was someone special, Mrs. Kim finished. Someone important. The idea hadn't occurred to Lucy. Frank had seemed like a regular old man, quiet and humble. But now she remembered how he carried himself, the way he sat with his back to the wall, the careful way he looked around the room when he first came in. Maybe there was more to Frank Sullivan than she had realized. Around noon, the lunch rush started, and Lucy got busy with orders and refills. But she noticed something strange happening outside. Cars were slowing down as they passed the diner, and some were even stopping across the street. People were getting out and taking pictures of the building. Pete, Lucy called during a brief lull. Have you looked outside lately? Pete went to the window and peered out. That's weird. Why are all those people taking pictures of our place? One of the regular customers, a man named Bill, who worked at the gas station next door, overheard them. Haven't you folks been watching the news today? He asked. No, Pete said. Why? Bill pulled out his phone and showed them a news article. There's some kind of story going viral on social media, something about a waitress and a veteran. The article mentions Ruby's Diner. Lucy felt her heart start beating faster. What does it say? Bill scrolled through the article. It's not very detailed, just says that an act of kindness at a local diner has caught the attention of military personnel. But people online are trying to figure out which diner it is. More people were gathering outside now, some with cameras and phones. A few were pointing at the diner's sign and talking excitedly to each other. This is getting weird, Pete muttered. Around 2 o'clock, Lucy was taking an order from a family with 3 young children when she heard a sound that made her freeze. It was low and rumbling like thunder, but it wasn't coming from the sky. It was coming from down the street. The family she was serving stopped talking and looked toward the windows. Other customers were getting up from their tables and moving toward the glass. The rumbling sound was getting louder, and now Lucy could feel it in the floor beneath her feet. What is that? One of the children asked his mother. Nobody answered because nobody knew, but whatever was making that sound was getting closer, and Lucy had a feeling that her quiet life was about to change in ways she couldn't even imagine. The rumbling grew stronger, and car alarms started going off in the parking lot. Whatever was coming down Main Street was big, heavy, and heading straight for Ruby's Diner. Lucy looked down at the small flag pin on her uniform and wondered if Frank Sullivan was somehow connected to whatever was about to happen. The phone call from the Department of Defense, the people taking pictures, and now this mysterious rumbling sound, it all had to be related to the kind old man she had served the night before. She was about to find out just how much one act of kindness could change everything. The rumbling sound grew so loud that the coffee cups on the tables started to shake. Lucy had never heard anything like it before. It wasn't a truck or a bus or even one of those big construction vehicles that sometimes came through town. This was something much bigger, much more powerful. Everyone in the diner had stopped what they were doing. Conversations died mid-sentence. Forks were put down on plates. Even the 3 young children at table 6 had gone completely quiet, their eyes wide with curiosity and a little bit of fear. The only sounds were the rumbling from outside and the nervous breathing of 20 people all wondering the same thing. What was coming down their street? Lucy found herself moving toward the front window along with everyone else. Pete was already there, his face pressed against the glass, trying to see around the corner where Main Street curved toward the highway. Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Kim had gotten up from their booth and were standing right behind him, both women, clutching their purses like they might need to run at any moment. I can see something, Pete said, his voice barely above a whisper. Something big and green. The family with 3 children had moved to the window, too. The youngest child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, tugged on her mother's shirt. Mommy, what's that noise? I don't know, sweetheart, her mother replied, but Lucy could hear the worry in her voice. Then someone outside started shouting. Lucy couldn't make out the words, but the tone was excited, not scared. More voices joined in, and she could hear people running on the sidewalk. Car doors were slamming, and she could see neighbors coming out of their houses and shops, all looking in the same direction. "Oh my God," Pete breathed. Lucy squeezed in next to him at the window, and what she saw made her knees go weak. Coming around the corner, moving slowly and deliberately down Main Street, was a massive military tank. Its olive green paint gleamed in the afternoon sun, and the long barrel of its cannon pointed straight ahead like it was leading a parade. But this wasn't just one tank. Behind it, Lucy could see another one and then another. "Are those real tanks?" asked Bill from the gas station, his voice cracking a little. Nobody answered because everyone was too shocked to speak. The lead tank was getting closer now, and Lucy could see a soldier in the hatch at the top, wearing a military uniform and looking directly at the diner. Following the tanks were military trucks, the kind she had seen in movies about the army, painted the same olive green and filled with soldiers. The whole convoy was moving at about 5 miles per hour, slow enough that people could walk alongside it, and that's exactly what was happening. Dozens of townspeople were following the vehicles, some taking pictures with their phones, others just staring in amazement. Lucy recognized Mr. Patterson from the hardware store, Janet, who worked at the post office, and the Thompson teenagers who were supposed to be in school, but were obviously skipping to watch this incredible scene. "They're stopping," Pete said. And sure enough, the lead tank was slowing down even more. Lucy watched in disbelief as it came to a complete stop directly in front of Ruby's diner. The other tanks lined up behind it, and the military trucks positioned themselves in the parking lot of the grocery store across the street. The soldier in the hatch of the lead tank was definitely looking at the diner now. He was an older man with gray hair and more medals on his uniform than Lucy had ever seen on one person. He said something to someone inside the tank, then began climbing out of the hatch. "This can't be real," Lucy whispered. But even as she said it, she knew it was absolutely real. The tank was sitting right there in front of her workplace, as real as the coffee pot behind the counter and the worn linoleum under her feet. More soldiers were getting out of the trucks now, all of them, in dress uniforms that looked like they were prepared for some kind of ceremony. Lucy counted at least 30 soldiers, maybe more. They were lining up in formation behind the tanks, standing at attention like they were waiting for orders. The people inside the diner were pressed against the windows now, everyone trying to get a better look. The little girl who had asked about the noise was now climbing on a chair to see over the adults. Her father lifted her up so she could see better, and she pointed at the tank with excitement. "Look at the big truck, Daddy." "That's not a truck, honey," her father said softly. "That's a tank." Outside, more people were gathering. Lucy could see that Main Street was filling up with curious residents who had heard the noise and come to investigate. The mayor's car pulled up at the end of the block, and Mayor Johnson got out, looking just as confused as everyone else. The police chief was there too, but he didn't seem worried or like he was trying to control the situation. He looked more like he was waiting to see what would happen next. The gray-haired soldier who had climbed out of the lead tank was walking toward the diner now. He moved with the confident stride of someone used to being in charge, but his face was friendly, not stern or threatening. Behind him, 2 other soldiers were helping someone else out of one of the trucks. Lucy's heart nearly stopped when she saw who it was. Frank Sullivan, the elderly veteran from the night before, was being assisted down from the military truck, but he wasn't wearing his old worn jacket anymore. Instead, he was dressed in a formal military uniform that looked brand new, with ribbons and medals covering the left side of his chest. Even from inside the diner, Lucy could see that there were a lot of medals, more than she had ever seen on anyone. Frank looked different too. Yesterday, he had seemed like a tired old man who was struggling to get by. Today, he stood straight and tall, walking with dignity and purpose. The soldier helping him down from the truck treated him with obvious respect, the kind of respect reserved for someone very important. "Is that the man from last night?" Pete asked quietly. Lucy nodded, unable to speak. She watched as Frank looked toward the diner, scanning the windows until his eyes found hers. When their gazes met, he smiled and raised his hand in a small wave. It was the same kind gesture he had made when he left the night before, but now it carried a weight that Lucy was only beginning to understand. The gray-haired soldier had reached the front door of the diner. Lucy could see him clearly now. He was probably in his 50s, with the bearing of someone who had spent his entire adult life in the military. His uniform had name tape that read Colonel Harrison, and the ribbons on his chest suggested he had seen action in several conflicts. Colonel Harrison looked through the window and made eye contact with Pete, then pointed toward the door. Pete looked at Lucy, then back at the colonel, then walked slowly toward the entrance. His hand was shaking slightly as he reached for the door handle. The entire diner held its breath as Pete opened the door. The colonel stepped inside, followed by Frank and two other soldiers. Suddenly, Ruby's diner, which had been filled with the normal sounds of clinking dishes and quiet conversation, was completely silent. Colonel Harrison looked around the room, taking in the faces of all the customers who were staring at him. Then his eyes found Lucy, standing behind the counter with Pete's small American flag still pinned to her uniform. "Are you Lucy Chen?" he asked, his voice clear and carrying easily through the quiet diner. Lucy's mouth felt dry, but she managed to nod and say, "Yes, sir." The colonel smiled, and suddenly his serious military bearing softened into something warmer. "Miss Chen, my name is Colonel James Harrison, and I believe you've already met my friend Frank Sullivan here." Frank stepped forward, and Lucy could see tears forming in his eyes just like the night before. But these were different tears, not the tears of a lonely old man grateful for a free meal, but the tears of someone overwhelmed by an incredible moment. "Lucy," Frank said, his voice thick with emotion, "we have something very important to tell you." Lucy felt like she was in a dream. Colonel Harrison stood in the middle of Ruby's diner in his perfectly pressed uniform, surrounded by other soldiers who looked like they had stepped out of a military ceremony. Frank was beside him, transformed from the quiet old man she had served the night before into someone who clearly commanded great respect. Everyone in the diner was staring, waiting to hear what could possibly be so important that it required tanks and a full military escort. "Miss Chen," Colonel Harrison began, his voice carrying clearly through the silent diner. "What you did last night for Mr. Sullivan here was a simple act of kindness. You saw an elderly veteran and made sure he had a good meal. You probably thought nothing more of it." Lucy nodded, still not trusting her voice to work properly. She glanced at Pete, who looked just as stunned as she felt. The customers who had been eating lunch were now completely focused on the colonel, their food forgotten. "But Frank Sullivan isn't just any veteran," the colonel continued. "Frank is one of the most decorated soldiers in American military history. He's a recipient of the Medal of Honor, our nation's highest military decoration." A collective gasp went through the diner. Mrs. Rodriguez put her hand over her heart, and Mrs. Kim reached over to squeeze her friend's arm. The family with 3 children moved closer, even the youngest sensing that something very important was happening. Frank stepped forward, looking embarrassed by the attention. "I never wanted any fuss," he said quietly. "I just did what any soldier would do." Colonel Harrison smiled at his friend's modesty. "Frank, you're going to have to let me tell the story properly." He turned back to Lucy and the gathered crowd. In 1951, during the Korean War, Sergeant Frank Sullivan was part of a unit that came under heavy enemy fire on a hill they called Heartbreak Ridge. The fighting was intense, and Frank's unit was pinned down with no way to retreat. The diner was so quiet that Lucy could hear the coffee pot bubbling behind the counter. Outside, she could see that more people had gathered, pressing against the windows to try to hear what was being said inside. Frank's commanding officer was badly wounded, the colonel continued, and 17 soldiers were trapped in a position where they would have been killed or captured within hours. Frank could have retreated to safety with the rest of his unit, but instead, he chose to stay behind. Frank was looking down at his hands, clearly uncomfortable with having his story told. But Lucy could see pride in his eyes too, the kind of pride that comes not from boasting but from knowing you did the right thing when it mattered most. For 6 hours, Frank held off enemy forces by himself, while organizing the evacuation of his wounded comrades. He was shot twice but refused medical attention until every single one of those 17 soldiers was safely evacuated. By the time reinforcements arrived, Frank had single-handedly held a position that should have required a full platoon. The little girl at table 6 tugged on her father's sleeve. "Daddy, what's a hero?" she whispered, loud enough for everyone to hear. Her father's voice was soft when he answered, "Someone like Mr. Frank, sweetheart." Colonel Harrison nodded approvingly at the father's answer. That's exactly right. Frank saved 17 lives that day, and those 17 soldiers went home to their families because of his courage. But Frank never talked about what he did. He came home from Korea, worked as a mechanic for 40 years, raised a family, and lived quietly in this community. Most people had no idea what he had done. Lucy looked at Frank with new eyes. This gentle man who had been so grateful for a simple meal had risked his life to save others. She thought about how he had counted his dollar bills so carefully, how he had only ordered coffee, how he had thanked her with tears in his eyes. After Frank's wife passed away 2 years ago, the colonel continued, he became even more withdrawn. He was living on a small pension, not asking for help from anyone, not talking about his service, until last night. Frank finally looked up, his eyes finding Lucy's across the diner. When you gave me that meal, he said, his voice growing stronger. When you treated me with such kindness, it reminded me of something I had forgotten. It reminded me that there are still good people in the world, people who care about others, without expecting anything in return. Frank called his old unit association last night, Colonel Harrison explained. It was the first time he had contacted any of his fellow veterans in over 5 years. He told them about a young woman who had shown him kindness, who had treated him with respect and dignity. He said it had given him hope again. Lucy felt tears forming in her own eyes now. She had just been trying to help someone who seemed to need a meal. She had no idea that her simple gesture would mean so much to Frank. Word spread quickly through the veteran community, the colonel said. Frank's story has always been legendary among those who served, but hearing that he was struggling, that he was alone, and that one person's kindness had made such a difference to him, well, that was something we couldn't ignore. One of the other soldiers stepped forward. Lucy could see from his uniform that he was also a colonel, though younger than Harrison. Miss Chen, I'm Colonel Rodriguez. My father served under Frank in Korea. He was one of the 17 soldiers Frank saved that day. Lucy's hand went to her mouth in surprise. The soldier continued. My father lived to be 78 years old. He saw me graduate from West Point, walked me down the aisle at my wedding, and held his grandchildren. All because Frank Sullivan refused to leave him behind on that hill in Korea. Another soldier spoke up, this one a sergeant who looked to be in his 30s. My grandfather was there too, ma'am. Frank saved his life, which means he saved my family's future. When we heard that Frank was struggling and that your kindness had touched him so deeply, we knew we had to do something. Colonel Harrison gestured toward the window, where the tanks and military vehicles were still visible. What you see outside represents more than just active-duty military, Miss Chen. Those soldiers out there include veterans from 3 different states, National Guard members who drove through the night to be here, and active-duty personnel who used their leave time to honor Frank and thank you. Frank walked closer to Lucy, moving slowly but with dignity. Lucy, what you did for me wasn't just about a free meal. You saw me as a person worth caring about. You treated me with respect when I felt forgotten by the world. That kind of kindness is rarer than any medal. The diner erupted in applause. It started with Mrs. Rodriguez and Mrs. Kim, then spread to every customer in the restaurant. Pete was clapping so hard his hands were turning red. The family with 3 children was clapping, and even the youngest was trying to mimic her parents. Outside, Lucy could see people applauding through the windows. Colonel Harrison waited for the applause to die down before speaking again. Miss Chen, we're here today to honor both of you. Frank for his extraordinary service to our country, and you for reminding all of us what kindness and respect look like in action. Frank reached into his uniform pocket and pulled out a small, wooden box. Lucy, this is for you. It's not much, but it's something I want you to have. Lucy opened the box with trembling hands. Inside was a small medal, simple but beautiful, with a ribbon in red, white, and blue. It's a certificate of appreciation from the Veterans Administration, Frank explained. But more importantly, it's a thank you from 17 families who exist today because of what happened on a hill in Korea 70 years ago, and from one old soldier who was reminded that kindness still matters. Lucy looked around the diner, at all the faces watching her, Pete, the customers, the soldiers, and Frank. She realized that her simple act of kindness had created something much bigger than she ever could have imagined. The story was far from over. What happened next was something nobody in the small town had ever experienced before. The soldiers didn't just leave after the ceremony in the diner. Instead, they rolled up their sleeves and got to work. Colonel Harrison explained that they had 3 days of leave approved, and they intended to use every minute of it to show their appreciation. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Ruby's Diner had been transformed into the center of the biggest community event anyone could remember. The tanks had been moved to the parking lot of the elementary school down the street, where children and their parents could look at them safely. The soldiers had set up a small information booth where they were talking to people about military service and Frank's heroic story. But the real surprise came when a group of soldiers walked into the diner carrying paintbrushes, tools, and supplies. "We noticed your place could use a little fixing up," Colonel Harrison told Pete with a grin. "We'd like to help if you don't mind." Pete looked around at his worn-down diner with fresh eyes. The walls hadn't been painted in years, several of the booth seats had tears in the vinyl and the front door stuck every time someone tried to open it. "I can't afford to pay you," he said honestly. "We're not asking for payment," said Sergeant Williams, a young soldier with a friendly smile. "We're asking for the chance to say thank you to the place where kindness happened." Within an hour, the diner was buzzing with activity. Some soldiers were painting the walls a cheerful yellow color, while others were fixing the broken booth seats and replacing the old light fixtures. A group of female soldiers had taken over the kitchen, helping Pete organize his supplies and showing him more efficient ways to set up his cooking area. Lucy watched in amazement as her workplace was transformed before her eyes. But the biggest surprise came when Mrs. Rodriguez approached her with tears in her eyes. "Lucy, dear," the older woman said, "my daughter just called. She saw the story on the news and she wants to help. She owns a restaurant supply company in the city." By evening, 3 delivery trucks had arrived with new kitchen equipment, fresh linens for the tables, and even a brand new coffee machine that didn't make strange noises. The driver of the first truck, a middle-aged man named Tony, refused to let Pete pay for anything. "My uncle served in Korea," Tony explained. "When I heard about what Mr. Frank did and what this young lady did for him, I knew I had to help. This equipment was going to be sold anyway. Now it's going to a place where it can do some good." The local news crew arrived around 6 o'clock, followed by reporters from the regional television station. But the soldiers made sure that Frank and Lucy were never overwhelmed by the attention. Colonel Harrison personally escorted them through interviews, making sure they felt comfortable and that their story was told respectfully. Lucy was amazed to see how the whole town had come together. Janet from the post office brought over fresh flowers for the tables. Mr. Patterson from the hardware store donated new signs for the outside of the building. The high school football team showed up to help with the painting, and the cheerleaders organized a bake sale to raise money for new dishes. But the most touching moment came when Tommy arrived after school. Lucy had called to tell him what was happening, but seeing it in person was overwhelming for her younger brother. He stood in the doorway of the diner, taking in the scene of soldiers working alongside townspeople, all because his sister had shown kindness to a stranger. Frank noticed Tommy's arrival and walked over to introduce himself. "You must be Lucy's brother," he said, extending his hand. "She told me about you last night." Tommy shook Frank's hand, still speechless at everything happening around him. Frank continued, "Your sister is trying to put you through college, isn't she?" "Yes, sir," Tommy managed to say. "She's been working double shifts to save money for my tuition." Frank smiled and looked around the bustling diner. "Well, I think that problem might be solved soon." By the second day, word of Lucy's story had spread far beyond their small town. The diner's phone was ringing constantly with people wanting to make donations or offer help. A veterans organization from the state capitol drove down with a check for $5,000. A local business owner who had never even eaten at Ruby's Diner offered to sponsor Tommy's entire college education. "I can't accept all this," Lucy told Colonel Harrison as they watched soldiers putting the finishing touches on the newly renovated diner. "It's too much." The colonel sat down across from her at one of the freshly repaired booths. "Lucy, do you know what the most powerful force in the world is? Lucy shook her head. Kindness, he said simply. When people see genuine kindness in action, it inspires them to be kind too. You started something that's much bigger than a free meal. You reminded everyone that caring about each other matters. On the third day, the town declared an official Frank Sullivan Day. The mayor made a speech in front of the diner, thanking Frank for his service and Lucy for her kindness. Frank was given the key to the city, and Lucy was named an honorary Citizen Appreciation Award. But the most meaningful moment came when Frank asked if he could have a permanent table at the diner. I've been lonely for too long, he admitted. If it's okay with Pete and Lucy, I'd like to become a regular customer. I'll pay for my meals, of course, but I'd love to have a place where I belong. Pete didn't hesitate. Frank, you can have any table you want anytime you want it. They designated the corner booth where Frank had sat that first night as Frank's table. A small brass plaque was installed that read, "Reserved for veterans and friends." Frank would sit there every Tuesday evening, and other veterans from the area began joining him. What started as one lonely old man having coffee became a weekly gathering of people who had served their country, sharing stories and supporting each other. The story didn't end there. Over the following months, Ruby's Diner became known as the most veteran-friendly restaurant in 3 counties. Veterans passing through town would stop by specifically because they had heard about Frank's table and Lucy's kindness. The diner's business tripled, and Pete was able to hire 2 more employees. Tommy started college that fall with a full scholarship funded by donations from people who had been inspired by his sister's story. He called Lucy every week to thank her, but she always reminded him that kindness was its own reward. Lucy kept Frank's original flag pin, the one he had given her that first night, but now it was joined by dozens of other pins, patches, and small gifts from veterans who visited the diner. Each one represented a story, a life touched by the simple idea that treating people with respect and kindness matters. Frank lived for 3 more years, becoming the unofficial grandfather figure for the entire town. When he passed away peacefully in his sleep, hundreds of people attended his funeral, including many of the soldiers who had been there that amazing day when the tanks rolled up to Ruby's Diner. At the funeral, Colonel Harrison told Lucy something she would never forget. Frank used to say that you saved his life that night not with the food but with the dignity you showed him. You reminded him that he mattered, that his life had value. That's the greatest gift anyone can give. Today, Ruby's Diner is still thriving. Frank's table is still reserved for veterans and Lucy still works there, though now as the assistant manager. The small American flag pin that started it all is displayed in a frame on the wall with a sign that reads, "Kindness multiplies." The story proves that sometimes the smallest acts of human decency can create changes that last for generations. Lucy never set out to be a hero. She just saw someone who needed help and decided to help. But in doing so, she reminded everyone around her that the world becomes a better place when we choose to care for one another. And that's a lesson worth remembering.